I can sit next to Sarah.
Hello everyone. Can the people at the back hear me? Okay, good. Thank you for joining us this afternoon to talk about democracy. I'm very excited to have a great panel here. Lucy Powell, MP, is just on her way over from the main conference sites and will be here shortly. But we thought we'd get started rather than keep you all waiting longer than you already have. So I'm going to just briefly introduce the other three members of our distinguished panel. And I'm going to give them, panelists will speak for about 5 minutes each, and then we'll make sure we've got plenty of time for questions and discussion with all of you. So I'm Sarah Gully, I'm IPPR's Director of Policy and Politics. And to my right, we've got Dr. Parth Patel, who is also from IPPR and leads our work on democracy and politics. And then on my far left, we've got Martha Dalton, who is the founding partner and managing director of Lodestone Communications. And also co-founder of the cross-party grassroots organisation Register Her to Vote. Did I say that right? Register Her to Vote. Okay, dedicated to encouraging women to vote. And then on my left, we have got Ellen Berry, who is head of the UK Democracy Fund, which is an independent, non-partisan fund focused on building a healthy democracy. And many thanks to the UK Democracy Fund for supporting this event today. So I will go to our speakers in the order in which I've just introduced them, and then hopefully seamlessly Lucy Powell will arrive in time to make her remarks and then take questions from all of you. So I'm going to hand over first to Parth.
Thanks, Sarah. Yes, I can. Hello, does that work? Hi everyone. It almost feels excessive to use a microphone in a theatre room like this, but I shall. Okay, so I think this question has become very relevant all of a sudden again, because we just had a general election where 1 in 2 adults, voting age adults, voted. Right, that's the lowest share of the voting age population in this country since women got the right to vote. So it's pretty shocking, and that's that includes people who are off the voting age but not actually registered to vote. And that's on a trend that has sort of built up over 3-4 decades, but seems to be gathering a bit of steam. And it's not sort of exclusive to the UK, but there is a lot of country-based variation. Spain has just had a record high turnout election, whereas we've had a record low turnout election. And maybe I'll keep my comments to 2 things. 1, why we at the IPPR think that matters, and 2, what can we do about it? So why does it matter? Why is this a problem that only 1 in 2 adults voted at the election? It's half the population. It's also very unequal. Places that are generally older or whiter or have a higher share of homeowners or people on higher incomes voted in much higher numbers than places that didn't have those characteristics. So that's a problem, because this is a relatively obvious fact or statement, but I think it's sometimes overlooked, that the future is susceptible to human influence. And that's kind of the whole point of democratic politics. And within that, elections are essentially the key thing that helps us shape that future, right? It's a moment at which we can decide as a collective, as a nation state, what kind of values we want to instill in that future, what kind of policies might help us operationalize that, and what kind of people we want to put in charge of governing it. And so elections in that sense are the essential guarantor of human agency. And so it really matters who participates. And therefore this question is pertinent. Why did only 1 in 2 people turn up to vote? And why was it so skewed? That skew is leading to political inequality. It's a source of political inequality. And that, for us at the IPPR, is something that is kind of overlooked by progressives, by people like the Labour Party and others. It's largely a blind spot in the agenda for justice that sort of centre-left parties always pursue. And it's a blind spot that populists are exploiting. Because populists play on this kind of basic tension of the people versus the elite. That, in its sense, is a logic of political inequality, and they are using that, and sort of it's quite effective. And so we are arguing that sort of political inequality should be brought back into the sort of the view of progressives from a policy perspective, from a political perspective, right? From a policy perspective, in general, public policy in this country, and in virtually every other rich country, is more responsive to the haves than the have-nots. So that's people who are on higher incomes, or people who have more wealth, people who have been to university. Public policy in general matches their interests and their preferences more than it matches the other side. That's at the heart of a lot of public policy puzzles in our democracy, right? Why we have locked a generation out of affordable homes, why we've tolerated income and wealth inequality to rise and remain so high, why it's much harder for a government to cut winter fuel payments compared to cutting benefits of working age people. That's all part of the same logic. It also matters politically, right? I mentioned populism because this idea of political inequality is a perception of influence. How much influence do I have over what the government does? That's really stratified. Renters are more than twice as likely than homeowners to say their view doesn't really matter for what government does. That is even more stark between the lowest third of earners compared to the highest third of earners. And so you get this kind of this general perception that actually there's no point me voting because whatever I do say, the government doesn't care. And the government has less of a interest in actually responding to your interest, and you get this doom loop that occasionally leads out a populist roar, but otherwise is a group of people who often don't vote.
Sorry.
That's okay. I was just describing why people should turn up and vote.
Good.
Very much. Why we think it's a problem.
Littleton.
And so 2 more minutes. Okay, so I've spent a lot of time on sort of why I think this matters, why it matters that only 1 and 2 adults stand up at the general election this day. So what do we do about it? Look, those 2 problems I've just set out, they are about much more than elections, right? If you do want to get towards a more politically equal Britain, if you do want to sort of combat populism, obviously just reforming elections is not the thing that's going to do it, right? But it's a necessary first step. If you can't do some of the easy stuff, like modernising elections, you're not going to get onto the hard stuff, like thinking about the media ecosystem. And so, and I think the Labour government largely agrees with this. In the King's speech, there was a commitment that this government is committed to improving the integrity of elections and widening participation in democracy, right? So we've got that. Everyone's largely on the same page as to this is a problem. We need to do something about it. The tricky question is how. How do we actually do it? And I'll end here. I think there are 3 strategies that policymakers should consider if they are trying to increase participation in an election, as the title of this panel asks. The first is you can make voting easier, right? That's before election day and on election day. Before election day, there are ways in which the registration mechanism by which you have to go through in this country before you can actually turn up and vote on election day, that could be made easier. That could be forms of assisted voter registration, it could be forms of automatic voter registration. It's very common across most European countries to have a form of assisted automatic voter registration. It's increasingly common across most United States states. We don't really have that at the moment. That's something that government should think quite hard about. On election day, things like voter ID seem to have some kind of impact, maybe not very big, but some kind of impact. But also the day you hold an election does have quite a big impact, right? Is it a bank holiday? Is it a weekend? These are quite small things that could make quite a big difference. Making voting easier, that's one thing. The second thing is making voting more worthwhile. This one's a bit harder, right? What we want ideally is a democracy where my vote is equal to your vote. And that's not quite the case in this country at the moment, but there are small things that I think broadly are not politically controversial that we could think about. The population-based boundary reviews, that could help us, right? People who live in inner cities, it's not, why do their votes relative to one another count less than people who live in rural areas? That is something we could make through a population-based boundary review. And the last thing I will say is that policy makers should think about how the state can create norms of voting. Right, that's different to coercion. That's not like a everyone there should be legally obliged to turn up to vote, but the state does have a role in creating norms and habits. So how do you socialize the habit of voting quite early on? Lowering the voting age could be one way to do that. That would have to come across, I think, with some school reforms. It could be a school trip up to the ballot box on election day. There's ways you could think about this. In Belgium, they have an election day convocation, so it's actually a national holiday. And a bit like how people are called to the jury service to serve on a jury, people are called up by random to serve at the ballot box to count votes. That kind of thing can have a real cultural effect and create a norm and habit of voting, where actually participating in elections is something that everyone just sees as a basic part and duty of their citizenship.
Brilliant, thank you. That was a great introduction to the questions that we're here to discuss, and very welcome to Lucy, Lucy Powell MP, who is now leader of the House of Commons, and has just, I think, come from the conference floor today where you've been delivering your speech. So thank you for making the time, especially given that it's pouring with rain. If it's okay, Lucy, I might come to you next, and then I'll go to our other panelists after that. Let me pass you a microphone.
Thank you very much. And yes, I've just got here and obviously the rain's completely ruined my hair, which is now the thing I'm most bothered about. But great to be here this morning. These are important things in politics. Anyway, let's not go into that. Look, I think this is a really important sort of conversation, and one of the messages I was just delivering on the conference floor is that we do sit under this mushroom cloud of cynicism about politics and politicians in general that's been fed for many years, and that's giving this sort of rise to populism and easy answers and quick fixes and easy solutions and all the other issues that we know about. So I think part of that is how can you mechanically and through an agenda of change that will encourage people to be more involved in the political process. But I think the bigger sort of question really is how can you prove the point that actually politics matters and it can change people's lives for the better? Because I think that mushroom cloud of cynicism suggests that we're all the same, that politics doesn't bring about change. And we've got this one moment now that's sort of fallen on our shoulders really in our moment in time to really prove the point. And we've been given that opportunity, and it's quite a big responsibility that rests on our shoulders. So, I mean, just on the sort of first point about the kind of technical, slightly more technical end of the argument, how can we kind of improve the sort of system? And you've outlined and you mentioned a few things there. We have got a big agenda for reform. Some of that's already been outlined in our King's Speech. Some of it will come later. Some of it is well known and manifesto commitments. We have already begun the process of reforming the House of Lords, which is something that people want to see. We've got a clear manifesto commitment to votes at 16, which I think will engage young people. It means that then there will be more responsibility on schools and others to kind of engage young people in that process and get them in earlier around taking part in politics. Some of the questions you raise about voter ID and sort of making that easier. We will have an elections bill coming at some point over the course of this parliament. It's not in the first King's Speech, but we have other sessions. We've got this massive agenda for devolution, because I think decision making where it is affects people the most is a really important part to re-engaging people in that political process. But I do think the most important thing I want to kind of say is that actually delivering real life change for people in their everyday lives and following through on our promises and our commitments and actually doing what we said we would do is the best antidote we've got to cynicism and populism and sort of cutting through that mushroom cloud that I describe. And that's why we are sort of getting on with that at pace. And I just said on the conference floor, like lots of the things that we've already done in the 12 weeks we've had a parliamentary majority, and the list is a really good list. You know, we've begun the process of putting rail back into public ownership. We've introduced the legislation for GB Energy that started its way through Parliament. We've passed our first law, the Fiscal Responsibility Act, as it now is, so that Liz Truss can never happen again. Introduced the water bill so that water bosses will now face criminal sanctions if they keep polluting the rivers. We've introduced the bill for laws reform. I mean, the list goes on, and we've done a huge amount in a small amount of parliamentary time that we've had already in Parliament. I think it's really important that we as party members, not all of you will be, but many of you are, that we are the advocates for that, and we're able to sort of cut through the noise about what we aren't doing or what we're doing wrong, instead of actually all the things that we are doing that will bring about the change that people want to see. And also it's also about, you know, fulfilling those promises to people who've been let down for so long as well. Hillsborough Law, I'm so proud to make sure that was in the King's Speech. That was you know, obviously putting the King's Speech together was part of my job. Introducing Martin's Law, because we said to Vegan Murray we would do that. We worked at pace on the infected blood compensation scheme, for example. You know, it's really important that we follow through on these things, people who've suffered injustices for years. And I think, you know, on the sort of some of those wider issues, one thing that I have come to realise, I did kind of realise some of this before the election, but really important, you realise it a lot more as one of the main business managers, as leader of the House of Commons. You know, parliamentary time is incredibly precious. It is actually in really short supply. We might have a big majority in the House of Commons, so you think, oh, well, we could just do whatever we want really quickly. You can't do that. We've also got to get things through the House of Lords, where we're the third largest party. Well, we will remain probably the third largest party for some time. So getting things through Parliament is a tricky process and takes time and consideration. So we do have to prioritise. And so I do think it's right that what we're thinking about in terms of changing the law and legislation is to show as much impact as we can on changing people's everyday experience and lives, because I think that's the best work we can do, really, to kind of engage people with politics, rather than spending too much of that parliamentary time on changing the voting system or all those other things, because I don't think they would have the same impact on this agenda at this moment in time. So it is a precious commodity. We're using it very kind of wisely and strategically. We've got a packed agenda and we're doing stuff at pace, a lot of really big stuff at pace, so that we can hopefully in 3 or 4 years' time say to people, actually, this has had a real life impact on your life. That's why your vote matters so much, and that's why you should go to the ballot box and vote. That's the main thing I wanted to say. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think really important to get to that point of people having confidence that politics matters for them in their daily lives, and that actually politics and democracy has an impact, and that's great to hear. I'm going to just pass on quickly now, I think first of all to Martha, and then we'll come to Ellen last but not least. So Martha.
Hi there. Lucy, it's great to hear that you're kind of on board with the agenda, and it's something that, you know, I imagine everyone in this room really wants to help you make the case for, both from civic society, but, you know, in terms of the wider agenda. Because I think one of the things that I can see in terms of why it matters, but also why it should really matter to this Labour government, is if you look at the macro reforms that this government's trying to do, trying to drive growth and share opportunity more fairly, you know, that takes guts, and it takes up standing up to vested interests. And that for me is why I'm so excited about this government. Looking at the planning reforms, for example, you know, that's going to rip up NIMBY's ability to stop homes being built, which is fantastic. But if this government is going to be successful, we also need to make sure that the people who currently aren't voting have a reason to vote. And I think that the job of this government is to, yes, deliver, but it is also to make voting easier. So I don't think that we should lose sight of that. I worked on a report last year with 38 Degrees, and we had 18 recommendations, so I won't go on about all of them now, but I think there were 3 that I'd want to flag. One, and you know, it may be that we have violent agreement on the panel, but automatic voter registration to me is just such a no-brainer. When you are 16 and you get your national insurance number, why can't you be registered to vote? I just don't get it. It would save councils loads of money. It would really forge really great voting habits, because we know that if you don't vote at the start, it's really hard to get into the habit of doing it. Also, population-based boundary reviews, and I know that probably any MP in the room kind of rolls their eyes at that, you know, the thought of another boundary review, but bear with me for 1 minute. There are lots of people in those inner cities whose voices are not getting heard in the same way. And, you know, just to be kind of party political, it probably would mean that we get 8 more seats in London. You know, that's something to fight for from, you know, a Labour Party point of view, even if you don't care about the kind of social justice angle. And then thirdly, you know, voter ID, we know that the Tories brought it in just to solve a non-problem, and it probably backfired on them, because I know lots of young people actually it galvanised them to want to go and vote more. But also I think that there are really small things that don't require any legislation, any parliamentary time, just a bit of creativity. During COVID, there were push notifications to every mobile phone telling you about the public health concerns. Why can't we do that on polling day, telling people to vote? Why can't we do it when, if you have to register to vote, why can't we telling people across the country about those milestones? You know, it shouldn't take organisations like Ellen's to be spending huge amounts of money to remind people about their democratic right. You know, it's quite straightforward. And I think it's where government could use its vast power quite simply to make life less irritating for the general public. And then similarly, same-day voter registration. I don't see why you couldn't do that. I think it's, you know, there's probably many bureaucratic reasons why not, but I think it's something that we should look at. They do it in other countries, and I think we should be able to do it here. And I think, I guess, just a word of warning, like this is maybe not for the people in this room, you know, it's something that I'm really passionate about, but quite a geeky niche topic. But the thing is, if we don't care about it, it doesn't mean that no one else will. You know, 14 years of a Conservative rule, and they've been making it really hard for people to vote, young people. You know, that wasn't by accident. You know, that was a targeted policy change to make it harder for younger people to vote, because they're not going to vote for the Conservatives, or historically haven't. So I think we shouldn't kind of, you know, it's not just about being, you know, we basically all need to make sure that we kind of continue the campaign to do this. And I think that it's right, both from a moral point of view, but also for strengthening progressive politics and helping keep Lucy and the rest of the Labour government in power.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to hand straight over to Ellen for final thoughts from the panel, and then we'll open up for questions and comments from the audience. Thank you.
I run the UK Democracy Fund, and we've funded a huge number of grantees to do amazing work in the run-up to this last election to get low voting groups registered and taking part in the election. But they face the same long-term trends we've seen for a while in terms of like low levels of engagement, mistrust, and of course, for the first time in a UK-wide election, voter ID challenges. Yet people did incredible work, and not just our grantees, lots and lots of different organisations and institutions around the country. They reached huge numbers of people, and yet we're still seeing a really low turnout election. So clearly something is wrong. It's great that, you know, we know that the government wants to get systems working again. Like, a really good place to start is our Victorian electoral system, because it's just not fit for purpose. And obviously that's been talked about. But interestingly, in the last couple of years, the UK came 60th out of 169 countries in terms of the quality of our electoral register. So for perspective, that's below Oman and Kuwait. It's anyone who looks into the system becomes really, really clear that it doesn't work very well. So select committees said it's ineffective and inefficient. The people that run our elections, their body, the Association of Electoral Administrators, said it's bureaucratic and difficult to administer. And the Electoral Commission have said it doesn't work as well as it could for low voting groups. And the evidence of that is quite clear when you look at who is registered and who isn't at scale. And actually between 2018 and 2022, for the Black population, registration rates fell. For other ethnicity groups, it had a modest increase. So there's actually a widening of a gap here. And to take another group of people who are really heavily affected by our current, particularly the registration system, 20% of households in this country now rent their home privately. So it's gone up a lot, and there's no reason to think that won't continue growing. These are people that move really frequently. Many of them live in houses with lots of other people, and they don't get or see the letters from the local authority telling them to vote, many of them. they also potentially know they're probably going to have moved house before the next election. And I mean, when people move house, maybe getting on the register is not their first priority. It's probably going to be setting up their internet, because we know that's very, very difficult to get done. We can see that because those who've moved within the last year are at least a third less likely to be registered than people who've been in their homes for more than a year. It's very, very obvious what's happening there. And, you know, as our Friends of Generation Umbrella put it, it's creating an echo of when voting was the prerogative of the landowning classes, because people who own their homes rent at much higher rates than those that don't. In terms of voter ID, we know it affects certain communities more than others, people from racialized minorities, disabled people, and it's also hard to implement. So at the election, we've seen people being turned away, even though they had correct ID. And in other cases, ID not being effectively checked. That actually happened to me when I voted. So if this really is about challenging voter personation, it's not necessarily happening effectively. And I think it does really matter to people. You know, we work with lots of civil society organisations who are putting a lot of resource, time and money into registering people, and they don't understand why it has to be so difficult, why there are multiple barriers to taking part, registering before the deadline, bringing the correct ID and turning out on the day. We know that the Electoral Commission have said there's little evidence to say that the register is going to improve significantly without systemic change. And, you know, bluntly, I would say we just can't close the registration gap without automatic voter registration. And it's great that the government has shown interest in some of these reforms. These are really just sensible, money-saving solutions. It's not the most exciting policy, you know, like Martha says, it's kind of techie, nerdy stuff, but it can transform democratic equality and lead to really tangible public benefit for people. You know, we know that automatic voter registration is actually quite popular. So YouGov polling showed 81% of people think we should have it, and it's used in most democracies. And there are other simple things we can do to make the system more efficient and more secure as well, like abolishing the open register and having a simple website people can check if they're already registered. And voter ID can be canned. You know, when it was brought in, Labour in opposition argued that voting in this country is secure and it wasn't needed, and actually it would be a waste of money, and that's been proven correct. We know that it was a solution to a problem that didn't really exist, you know, negligible convictions for personation, but this year thousands of people were denied a vote because of it. You could expand the number of IDs usable, but that would reduce the number of people affected, but some people would still lose their vote. It would still maintain pressure on electoral administrators and the public purse, and there doesn't seem to be a significant benefit for that. And I would say that, you know, this is about suffrage, and it's something we probably shouldn't compromise on. Okay, it's great to see there's support for votes at 16 still there. It's brilliant news, because it does undercut inequality in voting in the longer term as well. As you know, Martha was saying, it's a habit forming. We've seen in Scotland, for example, when votes at 16 was introduced there, socioeconomic inequalities in voting dropped to that age range. So there's really genuine benefit of it, and particularly when it's paired with really good quality democratic education. We know it's easier to reach, you know, young people in educational settings because they can be shared information, they can have their peers and teachers remind them to vote. And from all the work we do with various communities, it's so much harder and more expensive to engage non-voting communities, you know, out in the community. So I would say that this is just a gift that the government can give to young people who've really felt unheard by government for quite a long time, who've grown up through COVID and you know, facing the economy currently. And it would also help undercut inequality at the same time. So I think this does need to be a priority for government soon, really, so that these changes can be made in time for the next election. It's been a year of global elections this year, and still more to go. And we know that from some of the data we've talked about, the UK and the mother of parliaments is not really on the top spot at the moment in terms of democratic engagement. If we can overcome these quite simple barriers, that creates some real opportunity to think about what the future of the democracy could look like and how we can really deepen engagement and re-establish our global standing. In terms of trust, you know, 45% of people almost never trust the government, according to some NatSem polling. And I would wonder if that would change if they felt that their involvement was really actively sought and that their views were taken into account and if they felt heard.
Brilliant. Thank you to all our panelists. Lots of really interesting food for thought. I'm going to now open it up to questions. I know that, oh yeah, still on our microphones, we can share. I know that Lucy may have to go slightly before the end of the session, so no, this is the reality of life as a minister at a conference. So if I could just please ask people to keep their questions brief and to the point. I will take a few at a time and then we'll ask the panel to come back, starting with Lucy. So lady on the end just here.
Hi, thank you very much. That was super helpful. You spoke a lot about the electoral system, but not so much about low levels of trust in MPs. What do you think role there is for modernising Parliament and the service it plays so that people have a better experience, feel more heard, and their perceptions of their importance is strengthened, plays, for example, relabeling parliamentary expenses, something more representative of what these costs are, or possibly even paying MPs so that they're incentivised to turn up more and actually scrutinise more. And it would be really good also to hear what the Modernisation Committee is doing beyond what's in the manifesto.
Right. So here in front, and then there's a gentleman just in front of me now.
Hello, I just like to mention 2 points. To have an election on a Thursday, which is a working day for most people in Britain, in the electorate, why not try shifting it to a weekend, say Sunday, like they do in France? Secondly, proportional representation. I think that should be brought in because our system of two-party system is out of date now, and I think we should have proportional representation installed.
Great, and then gentlemen, just straight ahead here.
Thank you, Tom Brake from Unlock Democracy. A question for Lucy Powell. I welcome the fact that the government are going to bring forward votes at 16. Can it be linked to automatic voter registration? Because you need automatic voter registration to ensure that those 16-year-olds are on the register so they can vote.
Great, thank you to everyone for keeping questions brief. I'm going to ask Lucy to come back first, and then I'll ask other panelists to give some very quick reflections, and then we'll try and fit in another round before Lucy goes.
Okay, thanks. So first on the Modernisation Committee, I didn't mention that in my opening. We have set that up already. It was met for the first time. So one of the things the first things that I did as leader of the House was bring forward a motion to tighten up the rules around MPs' so-called second jobs or outside earnings, and the Modernisation Committee, which was kind of foreshadowed by the last Labour government that had a Modernisation Committee. The remit of ours is a bit broader in that we'll be looking at raising standards in the Commons. We'll be looking at the culture and behaviour, some of the issues around that, and also making Parliament more effective, and how the role of a backbencher, how more scrutiny can be given to legislation and so on. And part of the broader piece that I've been doing as leader of the House is also about sort of restoring respect to Parliament as well. I think we've had a record number of oral statements coming to the House of Commons since the election. You know, announcements should be being made to Parliament first. That's the expectation that we have. Ministers should expect, robust scrutiny of their legislation, of their announcements and so on. And I think Parliament offers that in bucket loads, and it's more transparent. And, I'm going to be sort of keeping tally of ministers in terms of answering parliamentary questions and correspondence and things like that. So, I'm setting the bar higher on some of those things than in the past. I'll leave your points to others, but look, suffice to say, I think if we'd had PR at the last election, the big winners would have been reform. I'll just leave that there. And Tom, I mean, look, we'll obviously that work's not sort of begun yet. We've had lots of other priorities that we've had to get on with, but as we're looking forward to the next programme, the next session in terms of legislation, as I say, there will be some kind of elections bill that will look at some of those issues. So continue to engage with that with the government, and as we obviously will have to do kind of lots of discussions and sort of stakeholder conversations and things like that about what would or wouldn't be in such a bill.
Thank you very much. Do any of the other panelists want to offer very brief reflections on any of those questions? Or I can go out and do another round. You got time for a couple
Yeah,
more
yes,
questions? Okay, well, let's, chorus of hands. Right over on the end over there in the check shirt. Oh, sorry, at the back.
Hello, I live in a area not a million miles away from Lucy's constituency in Bolton, Walkden. And I want to touch a little bit on something that Ellen said actually about insecure renting. So we have a lot of HMOs in our area, and we have a lot, and I myself lived as a lodger with my last 2 rental properties before I bought with my husband. So my question is, I'm 100% behind both like automatic registration, but how that can be managed when there's so many people and insecure rentals. For example, one of my landladies lent on me not to register to vote because I realise now that's probably council tax fraud.
Can you just, for speed, just pass it along?
Thank you. There's been really interesting suggestions around engagement on voting day, but I'm really interested in the panel's views on ways of improving democratic engagement the rest of the year, the rest of the 4 or 5 year cycle, and whether there are innovations in kind of democracy that would have an impact on election day in turn.
Great. And then can we come down?
Thanks, Jennifer Naylor, Compassion in Politics. One of the things that our polling consistently shows is that introducing a law to prevent deliberate political deception would go down incredibly well with voters, with 9% of voters trusting what politicians say. This would not only be a way of heading off Farage at the next election, but would also be a way of creating a political space where there could be more trust, and Wales has already agreed to introduce it. So, Lucy, will you think about it for Westminster?
Thank you. Very interesting set of questions. I'm going to come to Lucy, and then I know you have to go.
Right, I mean, just I think on this point about churn and population and people living in private rented and HMOs, I mean, Manchester Central, I think, probably have one of the highest churns of voters and one of the biggest population increases in the country. In fact, the last election, going into the last, previously to the boundary change, my constituency was 105,000 electors, probably population more like 135,000. That's a big constituency. The Electoral Commission think my constituency is now about 70,000, but it's already 83, I think, and will be another 10, 15,000 by the time of the next election. So that is a challenge because my boundaries have changed significantly, and I think that is, you know, I'm a very, very, very sort of strong believer in the constituency link and that relationship that you have with your community and how you represent them, and that is a challenge when that moves around so much. But you make a really good point there about, I think we saw that a lot with students and student accommodation and some of those requirements there as well. Look, I think perhaps others can talk about democratic engagement throughout the year. Compassion and truth in politics is really important. There are lots of rules governing that already, actually, in terms of members of parliament, certainly, and how they behave. And look, I think Nigel Farage launched a bit of an attack on me a couple of weeks ago because he doesn't quite like the rules that he's now bound by as a member of parliament, and he doesn't really want me strengthening them anymore. Sorry about that, Nigel, but we'll see what we can do. And there are other things that will be coming. We're committed to the Hillsborough law, for example, which will create a duty of candour, and we do need to think about how that duty of candour sort of relates to the rules that we already apply to kind of Parliament and how you approach Parliament, because we also you don't want us to create a sort of legal framework where political disagreement or is then found itself to sort of somehow be criminalised as well. So I think we've got to think about these things carefully, but obviously the Modernisation Committee will be looking at strengthening the rules around MPs' conduct, and then we will have a duty of candour in legislation at some point, which will hopefully bring about some change there as well in culture.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Lucy, and thank you. No, it's understood and much appreciated, and great to hear both about the things that you've already been able to do and the fact that there is more to come and commitments to think about some of the things that people have raised. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to come now to Ellen, who I know what is saying. Thank you for your lovely scale.
Just a quick response on the issue of renters and HMOs. There's various ways that AVR could be put into place. So I believe the biggest government database is DWP, and lots of people receive one kind of benefit or the other. You know, I get child benefit, for example. Quite a lot of people receive it. So it does tend to reach a lot of people. I think the point is that one approach could be that when people interact with a government agency like DWP, changing their address to get a benefit, etc., these are the points where details could be updated. It's not a perfect solution, but the point is, if the vast majority of people are registered via AVR, the resources can be freed up by local authorities, civil society groups, electoral commission, to focus on the people that are particularly marginalised and hard to reach, and they could still be voter registration drives. It's almost inevitable that there would have to be, but they would be much, much smaller, targeted work, and we wouldn't be wasting resource on people that could easily be captured through existing databases.
Great, thank you. Parth or Martha, I don't know whether of you would pick up this point about engaging people kind of all the way through the year, all the way through the Parliament, not just on election day.
Go first, Martha.
Yeah, I think so. When I set up Register to Vote, we did that because at the time there was a discrepancy in terms of the number of men and women that were voting. That's kind of no longer the trend, thankfully. But when we did lots of outreach work with women, often the issue was that they just didn't think politics was for them, and that it was something that they didn't understand. But actually, if you talk to the people who said that they didn't understand politics, they actually had a huge amount of knowledge. They just didn't understand it when it was badged as politics. And so it made them feel like they didn't want to engage in the system. And so I think for people, it's about political education. I can see someone from the NUS in the audience. You know, there's political education, I think, could be really helpful, and working with those institutions like FE colleges, student unions at younger ages to get people involved so that they understand that it is for them. But also, if you've got a progressive government that is taking vested interests on, hopefully people will start to see that change can come and will be able to see the benefits well.
Thanks. I really agree with what Martha says. I think that question really touched on a broader issue, sort of the pointy edge of this entire conversation, which we've ignored, which is like the way in which people express themselves politically in our democracy has changed quite fundamentally, right? Expressing yourself in like the old classic institutional forms, like voting or being a member of a political party or writing to your MP, has collapsed, like massively collapsed. And what's gone up is expressing yourself politically in different ways, joining a protest or boycotting meat or boycotting flights. He says having just come off a flight. And so I guess the more demanding question is like, well, what kind of institutions would help us channel these new behaviors into public policy? So those new forms are useful, but they don't, there's a very complicated route through which they impact policymakers. Can we improve that? I think the conversations around deliberative democracy, direct democracy sort of touch at the edge of that. How can we sort of channel more citizen input into policymakers? What I don't like about that conversation is it's almost like an either or with the party-based conversation about what we do with elections. And I think there needs to be a more joined up conversation there of what like a slightly more demanding version of democracy might be for the challenges we face today. I might say one more thing, Sarah, before, because I too also have to run in a second. Because there's quite a few policy points, one about voter 16, one about AVR, weekend voting. I think these are all broadly quite good ideas. And maybe just a bit of a plug, we're going to be publishing some work on sort of an analysis of a range of options that sort of the government could consider if it wanted to do these things that could be quite easy and implementation stuff. So that would come out towards the end of this year, and we will have a clearer idea of what we think is worth pursuing within that election bill that Lucy mentioned in her remarks. And there was that first question about trust in MPs that I might take head on as well, because I think, again, there's a dimension of that that's often ignored, right? So processes in Parliament really matter. And I think the Modernisation Committee is potentially something that could be quite exciting. But it's only half part of the picture, right? And Lucy talked quite a lot about delivery and making voting worthwhile by just doing stuff that voters care about. That is true to some extent, but the other thing that voters do care about, and care about increasingly so, is how much politicians seem to represent them, like actually represent them. Doesn't matter what they do, but do they feel like they're on your side? Are they one of us, right? The job of a politician is not just to use the institution of the state to deliver on the promises made to voters. It's also just to aggregate public opinion and kind of push it back in a way that feels representative. And the politicians that nail this today are the right-wing populists. If you look at any Georgia Maloney clip, it is incredible how representative she is of the people she's trying to capture. Progressives are quite bad at this. The reason that Tim Walz is so popular in America is because he kind of gets this. And so I think there's an avenue of conversation to be had there about actually, can we raise trust in politicians by thinking a bit harder about the basic concept of representation?
Great, thank you. And I know Parth is off to talk about a decade of its national renewal, which is maybe another way to restore trust in politics. So I'll take one more round of questions. So gentlemen, just in here, yeah.
If Lucy was still here, I would have asked her if the government's going to restore the independence of the Electoral Commission. One of the things the Tories did, they did neuter it, and that's quite serious. And the other point is, when we're discussing PR, I don't think we should discuss it on the basis of which party is going to gain. It's the public to gain we should be looking at. Is it better for the democratic process? Because nobody knows what the effect will be of various systems. And my final point is this: most bills that leave the House of Commons, a quarter of the bill has not even been scrutinised, which is why it's left to the Lords to do it. And part of the reason for that is, and I regret part of it, I was part of the process in 1997, we introduced the timetable motions so we didn't have to have guillotines. Those timetable motions need to be relaxed. MPs have got to have the time to do better scrutiny and not leave it to the second chamber, where the rows occurred and everybody thinks, oh, it's undemocratic, second chamber's changing things. Because, as I say, a quarter of the bills have not been scrutinised that's coming forward at the moment.
Great, thank you. Other questions? Yep, so here, just here. And then behind.
So my name is Hattie Simpson and I was involved in co-organising the Labour campaign in Kensington and Bayswater. I'm also 18 years old and about to start university. And on the campaign trail, I have seen at this election, more so than I have at any other time, the amount of violence and negative lectures and things like that used towards women on the campaign trail. So I mean, the play The Constituent came out earlier this year on the topic of violence against female MPs, Jess Phillips' speech. It is clearly not restricted to the areas I was working in. What do we do to actually deal with this? Because it's having real consequences about young women wanting to go into politics. And it is something I am seeing all around me.
I'm similar, I'm also 18, so I was it's my first time voting this year, but I was kind of an issue of all my friends. I kind of struggled to convince them that it was worthwhile for them to vote. And I think there's a few issues, not just for young people, but of safe seats. I mean, I live in Lancashire, so and I was College in Wigan, so there was a lot of, it's been labelled for hundreds of years, so kind of how you tackle that, because we kind of knew what the outcome's going to be. But also, I feel like policy isn't really being targeted towards young people in the same way that it is for other generations. Like in the election, there was a lot of talk of the triple lot of pensions, but there was very little to make people like me want to turn up and incentivise them to actually vote.
Great, feels really appropriate given the conversation that we've had to have the last two questions, both from 18-year-olds. So that's a really nice way to end the questions. So a really rich set of issues raised there. I'm going to pass it over to Martha and Ellen to just give final reflections on any of those questions or on wider discussion. So we heard about the Electoral Commission, the importance of effective parliamentary scrutiny, the impact that, the kind of the atmosphere of violence or threat is having, particularly among women on the campaign trail, and then that sort of wider question about how you encourage people to vote, particularly in seats that feel very safe.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for those. I think in terms of the issue of misogyny against MPs, I would say that it's highly likely that that's contributing to the general sort of discomfort and mistrust people feel around politics. So I think we really need to be conscious of that, which, it feeds into people not wanting to take part. And in terms of, how to engage young people in voting, I suppose if until they are seen as an electoral force, it's potentially likely to be the same, because Parth made the point about how governments just are more responsive to people that vote, and that's all governments. It's not a party political issue, it's all governments. So that's a major factor. I think getting young people on the register would probably, you know, be a big step forward.
Yeah, firstly, just, you know, well done, and thanks for, you know, getting involved. Like, it's really impressive. And I'm from Bristol, and I had similar conversations with my friends in Bristol about what was the point. So I totally get where you're coming from. I think that just doing what you do by being involved and being young and female will help. So like, and I've been there, you know, no longer young, but it's about kind of showing your face and being heard and making the point, and coming and also telling the government that, you know, maybe that they do need to listen to you, and that is not okay. And I think that for lots of Labour politicians, they would like that to be the case, but they need you guys to shout a bit louder. Yeah.
Brilliant. Look, we're going to wrap up there. Thank you all for joining the discussion. Sorry, I couldn't get to everybody's questions. There were absolutely dozens of people who wanted to speak, which is hopefully a great sign for the health of our democracy, at least at this conference. So IPPR will be doing some more work in this space. So we're doing some work with Lodestone and with 38 Degrees around political equality, and we'll obviously continue working with the UK Democracy Fund as well. So there are lots of good organisations and people working in this space, and I think it is one of those issues where it really does feel like it needs a coming together of lots of different voices, different perspectives, different civil society organisations to really make an impact. So thank you all for being part of that conversation.
We did the Women in Public Life in Guernsey together. You probably can't remember.